if we can arm people with the information, they will help us reach optimal results instead of having to try to force people towards what we see as optimal. I think that's the theory of pivot.
Welcome to Workmorphous Wired, where we dive deep into the future of work and explore the transformative impact of AI and other emerging tech through conversations with thought leaders, policy experts, and industry innovators. Our guest today is Josh Richardson, Chief of Staff at the Indiana Department of Workforce Development. Josh has extensive experience in workforce, having served in various roles at DWD and as the Director of Indiana's Unemployment Insurance System. He has also worked in the office of Governor Mitch Daniels as the policy director, and he served under Governor Mike Pence. Josh previously served as Chief of Staff for Commissioner Fred Payne and advised state agencies on reducing fraud and improper payments in unemployment insurance systems. He holds a law degree from the Indiana University McKinney School of Law and a bachelor's degree from Ball State University. We invited Josh here today to talk about the recent announcement of the AI-driven tool Pivot, which is designed to help job seekers outline their career paths. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, Emily. I'm so happy to be here and excited to be part of your show.
We are too, and I was just reminiscing today about our conversations. I think it was about a year and a half ago in early 2023 about ways that states can better leverage data between different otherwise siloed agency operations to serve job seekers better. And just reflecting on how exciting it is to be back together and talking about how you've built that over the last year and a half.
Absolutely. And I think, as we'll get into it, it's been something that I've been excited about doing for a while. And so this last year and a half, our adventure with Pivot AI has been fulfilling many things that we'd like to do, but excited to be at the point that we're at.
Yeah, excited to get into it. And before we talk about Pivot, I'd love to talk a little bit more about your journey. So, if I'm understanding correctly, I think you have nearly 14 years of experience at DWD. Is that true?
So I'd probably stretch it a little longer than that, though. When it's that many years, you lose track of time. But I've been telling people lately more, about 17 years in and around workforce development, because I spent, after starting at workforce development, I moved into Governor Daniels' office for a little over a year and worked on labor policy and still around workforce development and unemployment insurance, back to the agency, then to NASWA, and back to the agency. And so all of that has had this real workforce and unemployment focus. So yeah, closer to 17 now.
Wow. So, what about workforce development attracted you in the first place?
So I wish that I had a really good story about what attracted me about workforce development. I'll tell you, it's one of those things, and I think lots of people's careers are like this and start this way. But I had been an intern with the Indiana legislature and really fell in love with policy making, right? I was the intern that where others were off connecting and talking about, their future career. I would be standing on the Senate floor listening to debate and really interested in the policy. And so when that ended, I went straight into law school, but after my first year of law school, there was a job posting for really the legislative role within the Department of Workforce Development. So the truth is, Emily, I think any agency that would have had a role like that allowed me to shift to night school and to work during the day in a policy-related job, I probably would have taken. But I always look back and think how lucky I was that it was in this space, because between unemployment insurance and workforce development, the two things that my agency does, they're really fulfilling to me in these things that I'm interested in, whether that's policy, politics at times, sometimes budget and finance issues. I really get to do a lot of things there that are exciting to me. So my interest was more because they had an open role, but it really grew quickly from there. I fell in love with a lot of the subject matter. So it wasn't the draw to workforce, it was the draw to having employment, and then it turned into a real passion for this kind of work.
I love that story. And it is actually a very interesting story, but I always like to ask people how they got into workforce development, because at least from my perspective, I've never met anybody who grew up wanting to work in workforce development. So it's kind of a path we all find in a messy way. So what would you say has been the reason why you've stayed in workforce development?
It really is, I think, the fact that it's so multidimensional that has been interesting to me. And I think you could probably say that about a lot of different roles. But so as an undergrad, I studied economics. And I think, it really feels like I get to apply a lot of that throughout my days, but then also, have the law degree and spend a great deal of time researching, often helping draft new legislation and new policy. And so I get to do all of those things. But I think also really just the connection to people. I think that we get to see tangible ways that the things that we do at the agency make people's lives better. And, that's something that's really exciting to me. I come from a family of educators mostly. And so, as I sort of went a different route, I missed that connection with people and the feeling at the end of the day that you contributed to doing something positive or helpful. And so I think that's kind of kept the passion going throughout the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Directly impactful and very interesting to hear your story. I know you've worn a lot of hats during your time in workforce development on the legislative side. Your title is chief of staff. I know you've overseen the unemployment insurance system. What is the scope of your day-to-day responsibilities now at DWD as chief of staff?
So, officially, the legislative affairs work, the research and analysis work, and the communications and marketing units report up to me. So, those are my direct reports. But I also work just alongside the commissioner to make sure that the daily operations of the agency go well, sort of general problem solving and troubleshooting. But it is that the research and analysis portion of this that's kept me close to the kind of data that we're using to deliver Pivot and some of these other activities. But so, I interact a lot with public officials through the governor's office and the legislature, even sometimes in local government, but then also, within the agency with my history in both running the unemployment insurance system and overseeing the workforce system for a little while. I sort of bring a lot of that into it. So I think it's, my chief of staff role is sort of there's the paper version of it, but it's also, I've got that institutional knowledge with that 17 years that we talked about, where a lot of things end up bubbling their way up that don't directly fall under my lines of direct reports.
Yeah. Well, and you're kind of a unicorn in a way because you've got a rich implementation experience and understanding of how the systems work, but you also have that vantage point and ability to lead in your position as chief of staff. And sounds like a confluence of all the right experiences that needed to come together to create Pivot, which I know was a long-term team effort. So for the background for our listeners, in November, DWD unveiled the new AI-driven tool called Pivot. The goal of the tool is to support job seekers in making career-advancing decisions by leveraging wage record data available to DWD. So really a creative way that DWD has really reached into its own data to better serve job seekers. And the idea is that this information will enable people who are seeking work to see current and future job opportunities based on their skill sets, their capabilities, and also real-time demand in the labor market. And Josh had said before that Pivot is just one tool in a broader workforce recommendation engine, which I want to come back to, but that engine is being developed as we speak. So, Josh, how did the idea for Pivot come about, and what problem were you aiming to solve?
So it came about organically over a long period of time. And I think what gets interesting is I think as long as 8, 9, 10 years ago, I was having discussions around, I mean, and then, AI was way off in the distance, but we were using terms like, machine learning and predictive analytics. But, as I worked in the state on unemployment insurance issues, we had problems with the financing of our unemployment insurance system, but there were reasons why I had opportunities to really dig into data that our agency had access to. And it's sort of, in some ways, it's, mind-boggling. Unemployment insurance wage records are this highly sought after piece of data. And so, roughly 3.2 million Hoosiers in the Indiana workforce, and the vast majority of those, 90% plus, have quarterly wage records. And so on a quarterly basis, we're hearing from employers at the individual record level, where they work, the earnings that they have there, oftentimes the occupations that they're doing there. And what we also had sort of in this other role was researchers, through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, researchers at top tier research institutions asking for access to our wage records through the BLS, to do studies on all sorts of interesting things. And so we knew that other people saw these wage records as really valuable. And yet, for us, they were really just sort of the essence of the unemployment insurance system, and we weren't doing much else with it. But so I think starting to think a little bit about how when you stack those wage records over a long period of time, because again, they go back decades, and then you start to add in educational records, whether those are records for us on training that people have pursued, or records at our partner agencies like the Indiana's Department of Education, which handles K-12, or our Commission for Higher Education. You really have this really good longitudinal set of data that helps you know how certain activities might impact people's career trajectory, how they might impact their earnings. And so, we've been looking at that and thinking about it. And when this idea first started, I'm not really sure that the technology was at a place where we could have done this. I mean, we could have ran predictive models, and there are things we could have done to directionally head this way. But as AI really started to take hold and not just exist, but started to be accessible to state governments, we were able to access people that had the knowledge to implement it. I think it started to seem like this was an idea that's time had really come, right? That the technology existed, that the conditions existed to make it possible. And then we were just really fortunate to receive a federal grant that allowed us to fund this work. And so it had been a desire for a while to really use this data that everybody else seemed to recognize was really valuable to have a positive impact to the people from whom we were obtaining the data. And I think that was an exciting part of it too.
Absolutely. Can you provide a high-level overview of how Pivot works both from the back-end side and from the user perspective?
Listening to your other guests on the show, I know that my knowledge of AI is far behind theirs, but I think I can help through this a bit. And so one is, our state, like many other states in the country, have an SLDS, sometimes referred to as SLED system. But this is a state longitudinal database system that includes a lot of different educational records. Indiana happens to be, I think, a little bit ahead of other states in its organization of that. And so that database already existed. In Indiana, we also have a group called a Management and Performance Hub that sits outside of our agency. It sort of sits independently, where record linkage can securely occur between agencies. So this is what really allows us to facilitate the matching of records. So what we're really doing is we're sending de-identified data into this environment after it's been linked by MPH, where we train an algorithm that looks for, obviously, patterns. We're looking for people moving from industry to industry. We're looking at things like their years of experience, looking at things like their education level as they come into the system, their unemployment insurance filing history, to create an algorithm in this secure environment. We then export that algorithm into a different environment in the cloud, so completely de-identified by this point. And as an individual files an unemployment claim, and this is where we're at with Pivot right now, and so trying to stay focused on what Pivot is, and I know we'll take some time to talk a little bit about where it may be headed, but where Pivot is at right now, we're able to take the information that individual provided to us as part of their filing for unemployment insurance, bounce it off of the algorithm. We score essentially all occupations, and we send them back a list of recommendations based on where individuals who look similar to them in the algorithm have seen the most success in occupational change. And so really it comes back to them just as this ranked list that they can then impact through their own preferences, because again, that's what's going to be most important, is their own buy-in to this recommendation. We're basically taking millions of lines of data that include wage records going back 10 years, 40 calendar quarters of wage records, and we're using those to develop this algorithm to help this singular individual figure out what path may make the most sense based on real outcomes of people like them in their area of the state.
What a rich data set to work with, and a great application to really lean into at DWD for the benefit of the user. It's interesting because having worked in a similar environment as well, and worked on similar challenges in a different state, one of the things that I think a lot of workforce professionals are trying to unlock right now is how to look at transferable skills, because we know that skills may transfer across different industries in ways that we may not conventionally think about. And it seems like, based on the rich data set that you have, you can really start to identify those trends without any bias of human intervention of, oh, well, if you're in this industry, you should probably stay in this industry. So that seems like an interesting potential benefit. Have you heard any feedback about that at all?
So I think that we're still working through that, but I do want to pick up on what you'd mentioned. So, Pivot is far from the only AI tool for connecting people with opportunities, right? These exist elsewhere, and they're actually really exciting. I have reasons why I think Pivot has a niche, but they're all exciting. But the basic way that a lot of those work is that they will take an uploaded resume, scrub them for that person's experience, and then they'll take job postings and scrub those and look for similarities. And so they're basically matching the person up based on the kinds of activities that are in their resume, the kinds of activities that are in the job posting, and they're moving from there. But there are a couple of problems with that, right? I mean, one is you have to have that person has to have a resume. They have to be able to upload it to identify their skills and all these other pieces. What Pivot does differently than those tools is we know that the skills are there when we see people move from one occupation to a different occupation, another industry. Intuitively, we know that clearly if patterns are showing successful movement from one spot to another, that there have got to be these underlying skills that are transferable. But we don't really have to identify them with this tool. We just know that we've seen those successful transitions because we're able to watch through these wage records the movement of that individual from one place to another. And because we're able to layer on sort of educational treatment and these different things that exist there, we sort of skip a step that a lot of other tools have to use. And so, the best feedback that we have right now is through the tool itself. And so people can provide feedback on the occupations that they've seen, and it's been, very positive so far. But one of the things that we're really looking at in the longitudinal sense are, how often do we see this be successful after a person's used the tool? And so we can tell, did they engage in any training that we had recommended? Did they make a movement to the occupation that we'd suggested? And then what were the outcomes? And so, because we just launched in November, we're still relatively early on in that. Wage records lag a little bit, 4 to 6 months, but we should start seeing some of those early results very soon here.
Okay, that's very exciting. What features are coming for Pivot in the near future?
So the thing that we're most excited about is that right now, and this is where I say this is always hard for me as we talk about Pivot, the sort of the current state, the expected launch here in the fall that we're working towards, and then obviously the future state, which is always the real exciting one, and you can talk about what's there. But so now individuals get occupational recommendations. They're limited to 15. And so anytime that they use this application, we're scoring and we're sending them the 15 top occupations that make sense for them. They can sort those so they can see them, but they're really going to stay with that 15. Last, then once they find the occupation, we now have to move them out of our system into a different system where they can then look for a training provider that could help them achieve the goals that they had met through Pivot. With the fall release, we're going to do two major things. They'll have access to all essentially 830 standardized occupation classification codes, and they'll be scored for them. So we think there's a real limitation with the 15 right now, that if that person has a career in mind, they can't really see the trade-offs between what they had in mind and what we've recommended. When we expand in the fall, they'll be able to do that. So if they came in, thinking that cosmetology, for example, is what they wanted to transfer to, they'll be able to find that in the tool, and they'll be able to see how that scores out for them based on people like them. What are the likely results if they were to pursue that? And they'll be able to compare that to our top recommendations. So really seeing the trade-offs of what they could expect over one training occupational path over the other in terms of earning, in terms of likelihood of completion, in terms of the length of time that it will take to complete training. So that's a big one, adding all of those. But then the other major part that we knew was missing when we launched our minimally viable product in November, and that is that we will make a recommendation of training providers. So we're able to leverage our eligible training provider list and other training resources that we have to, once that person has said, okay, I've looked at your scoring of occupations, I've decided that this is the occupation that's the most exciting to me. So essentially they give us yes feedback, right? The equivalent of the thumbs up to a Netflix or a Hulu recommendation. They've said, yes, I like this one. We take them to the next page where we'll say, okay, if this is the occupation that you want, and again, they should already know the expected wages, the length of time that it will take to train, the demand of this job. Now they'll see the training provider that we think makes the most sense for them. That's going to be based on, geography. based on cost, based on length of training, and then we're even going to include completion rate. So how often have individuals that have started this program completed it?
It sounds like a very user-centric approach where you're really thinking about the journey of the job seeker themselves and what their thought process looks like when they think about what is the next career opportunity for me and how do I get there. I also appreciate how you're factoring in demand to make sure that these recommendations are aligned with demand in the marketplace from employers who are hiring. And I'm curious to learn a little bit more about how that demand side of the equation works. Are you using labor market information as well as a consideration, or tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll start with the user centric side, and we know that it has to be. I mean, we know that if this comes off as a tool where the government is telling people, "Here's what you should do next," that it's not going to be as well received. And so the user centric part of this, but also giving that individual a lot of control over saying, "No, I'm not interested in doing 12 months of training. I'm more interested in doing 6 months of training." We've tried to make that a real centerpiece of the way that we think about it. But in terms of demand, absolutely. So we're using some subscription services. We also do some of our own work to forecast demand in different occupations, and so we are able to bring in, even in the current tool, anytime they're looking at an occupation, they can see both a measure of demand, but also the actual number of job openings in that current position in the county that they're in. Indiana's got a lot of counties, 92 counties within the state of Indiana, but they can see at the county level the number of openings in that occupation at this time. And so that's through a subscription service. But I think trying to make sure, we think that if we give people good information, they will make better decisions, right? I mean, that's a sort of a core belief of mine. And so we're trying to think, what are the things that are really going to matter to a person when they're making this choice? They're thinking, look, I might be willing to change careers if it would lead to better outcomes. And so, what information are they going to want to do that? And I think largely that's going to be wages. What will I get paid if I do this? How long is it going to take me to get there? And then also, how likely am I to find a job once I complete? And so demand has to be a part of that. And also, as we try to build confidence in people that using this tool will lead to better results, one of the worst things we could have happen is to tell a person, hey, if you take this course, you can expect these results, and it end up in them not finding a job, not successfully, because it's not a win just because they enrolled in the training or just because they completed the training. It's only really a win when they've been hired in that role and they're fulfilled by it. And then my hope is that they come back to the tool another time and say, how would I take that next step forward? What would be the next increment to increasing my earnings? And so demand is really everywhere throughout the tool.
Absolutely. As you think about the next phase of pivot and making those connections to training providers, training programs that can help a job seeker on their journey to this next employment opportunity, how are you thinking about DWD's job training programs such as Next Level Jobs and the Workforce Ready Grant? Is that a consideration to hopefully get more people into those programs, take advantage of them, or how are you thinking about that?
So it's a really good question. So our next level jobs program, specifically on our employer training grant side, is essentially it's funding to allow an individual, that lacks an associate's degree to pursue training, generally free of charge. Right? It essentially covers that. We do see a future of connecting these together where we, help screen the individual for their eligibility. In the next phase, the way that will practically happen, right? It hasn't been, automated. It's not being brought into the tool. But when an individual is reading through this, they can give us feedback. They can tell us, yes, they like the job, which again is going to help get them to a training provider. Or they can tell us, maybe or no, right? They have really three feedback, not just thumbs up and thumbs down, but they can say yes, maybe, or no. If they're telling us maybe or no, we're collecting more qualitative feedback about what is it that's keeping you from pursuing this training, right? That the algorithm thinks that you ought to be doing this, which, better than the algorithm does, but the algorithm that thinks you ought to be doing this. You said you were interested in the job, or it showed up here, you're reading into it. Now you're saying you're not quite sure. At that point in time, we can refer them to one of our Work One offices, our one-stop centers, as part of the tool. And so when they say maybe, they'll have a feedback option. They can tell us things like, I don't have adequate transportation. I can't cover the cost of this training. And when they do that, they can then opt into sharing their information with one of our Work One partners. And that will allow us, hopefully, to facilitate how we resolve that barrier. And so if the barrier is that they don't know how to fund it, that's when we would connect them up with our next level jobs programs or other programs, right? Whether that's WIOA funding or other state funding that's available. Trying to capture all of that in an automated way is still too difficult. And I know from some of your other shows, right? This is the question is, you know, how much can you do with AI? And then where do you hand it off to that knowledgeable person? Because, we're not quite able to cover it with the tool. And that would be an example of where we're at with this. They said, I like the training, but I can't do it because of this. How do we remove that barrier? And that's where the human part comes in. And so the referral is built out in the next tool, both referral to the institution if they say yes, a referral to a work one or an adult education partner if it's a maybe or a no, and it's something that we think we can help with.
Sounds like a great complement to the public workforce system and an opportunity to make sure that everybody is able to get served, but also still get access to that customized human touch that's really impactful.
I mean, I think that's it, right? It's the longer term vision of Pivot, without going into a lot of details, really is towards an automated career counseling tool, right? And it would be perfect if the person that was capable of full self service at 2 a.m. from home in their pajamas after working a second shift job that they found frustrating, could find, oh, this is a job that meets my interests. And yes, it will meet my financial needs. And yes, here's the training provider and here's the enrollment. But we know that that's a very small percentage of the population that's really going to get from beginning to end, even if we could build a tool that had all of those components. And so the real important questions are like, how do we tell through this progress where it's time to connect them with a person, and which person do we connect them with to make sure that we just reduce the transaction cost for that individual as much as possible, especially when they're interested in training that we know is going to make their life better, that's going to fill a need that an employer has, and ultimately make their community and the state will all benefit if this person takes that step forward. We just want to make sure that it's as easy as possible.
I know it's still very early in the process, but I'm curious, have you heard any early feedback from job seekers who have interacted with the tool?
So there are a couple of things that we can see in an automated way. And that is, if you think about the universe of who can access this tool right now, it is people who file for unemployment insurance claims. It just so happens that right now we're in the midst of a fairly long period of really low claims filing. So this launched in November, and from November of last year till now, Indiana has been at really historically low unemployment levels. Both from a rate perspective and from the unemployment insurance claims. And so it's low, but we've had about 50,000 claims filed in total since really that's more like since the beginning of the year. And more than half of the people that have filed claims have voluntarily chosen to use the pivot tool. It's not required. It doesn't impact their eligibility for unemployment benefits. And we're seeing roughly 1,000 people a week that say yes to a job that's been recommended to them. So that's really positive feedback. We have had people out in Work One offices, and I think there's still just generally, sort of curiosity about this. I think we're trying to move people a little bit more to seeing this as a possibility. And again, there are a lot of people who end a job and sort of already have the skills that they need to find another one and know where to go. And so we know that they won't use the tool, but we have been surprised by just the volume of people who are choosing to voluntarily use this tool on a weekly basis. Because when we've done activities before, and I think it's fairly industry standard, if, for example, we send an email to people saying, hey, you could potentially take advantage of free training, we're seeing, a 2 to 6% open rates of those emails with very little activity or follow-up. We've used banner ads on web pages before to try to get people to click in, that 2 to 6%. But in this tool, seeing 50 to 60% on a weekly basis of people voluntarily using it, I think that's exciting. But like I said, we really will only celebrate when we see someone who achieved the outcome that they sought because of the tool, and we're a little ways off from that.
Right. Well, I know it's very early in the process, but that is very exciting to see the impact of people taking advantage of this. And I think it goes to show that you really are meeting people where they are and not expecting them to come to the state for resources or to seek them out, because it can be very difficult to find and interact with services sometimes. So it's great to hear that, and to know that people are really taking advantage of it and that you'll have access to some more outcomes data soon. So if you're thinking about Josh Richardson sitting down a year or 2 years from now to a successful outcome, and you're really proud and you're talking about it, what would that outcome be?
So, biggest picture, what we're trying to drive towards is more people pursuing good quality training. And I know that that sounds really broad and vague, but I think it goes back to, talking a little bit about the problem statement. And people seem to make really inefficient choices about education, right? And oftentimes that inefficient choice is not to pursue it, when on paper, people who work in this field or study this, I think they know sort of, hey, look, that high school degree really isn't going to serve you as well as if you would spend even 3 or 6 or 12 months pursuing some sort of skilled training that separates you from others. But then they also a lot of times will enroll in training that seems to not maximize their outcomes. And so I think part of the goal here is really to try to show people the trade-offs between going directly to work or pursuing further training, or choosing one training pathway over a different one. And so I think it'll just be more informed decisions that are coming out of that. But I think also just trying to build people's confidence, because I think that generally people understand that if they would like to earn more money, one of the best ways to get there is through training. But knowing where to start, knowing which training, knowing how to access it, knowing, how they would compare one path over another is so hard that I think that we lose a lot of people in that process. And so I think that will be the real measure. We're absolutely going to be looking at sort of who did get into the tool and do they show up later in wage records and an occupation code that we'd recommended. I think that will be really exciting to us. But I think one of the other things that I'd really love to hear at some point in time, just sort of anecdotally, is one of those skeptical people telling someone else, hey, I had a weak moment and I did what this tool suggested I should do. And what they told me I would get, I did. And I think that would really change a lot of things, because I think we have a lot of people that have interacted with both education and workforce training systems and didn't really feel like they got the results that they had initially expected. And so that would also be a really exciting outcome to me.
Right. It's amazing because there are so many incredible resources out there, publicly funded workforce development resources, and they can just be difficult to find or to navigate for either a job seeker or an employer. And what you're doing is so powerful to help the end user feel empowered with access to real time data and information to make better informed decisions. And I'm confident that the outcome of that is going to be even more incredible than you expected, and you're probably going to learn so much throughout the process. So it's really exciting to hear. I want to talk a little bit about the process of implementation and get some advice for other leaders who might be in a similar position or starting out thinking about these kinds of tools. So I know that Pivot was developed by DWD in partnership with technology consulting firm Resultant. And you've previously mentioned that Indiana has done a lot of things to set the stage to make Pivot possible. So, when you were getting started, what did that project team look like, or how did you get started on this big initiative?
So, I'm lucky that our agency has a really good CIO, Chris Henderson, that's on our team. Was really good at setting that up. But a lot of it was taking an inventory of the types of data sources that would be available, and then bringing on Resultant in their team. So they brought a couple of data scientists along with them, data architects, to sit beside this project. We also brought on our state's privacy officer and their team, so that we could make sure that as we were doing this, again, AI is hard everywhere, but there are some additional sensitivities that occur in government. And so we wanted to make sure from the earliest stages that our sort of legal and privacy teams were involved in that. That group, along with some really solid project managers, really has made up the bulk of what the Pivot team has been to this point.
And as somebody who has now seen this through from an initial idea many years ago to implementation now, where you're starting to get some data and results, what advice would you give to a leader who has similar aspirations for what you are working toward, but maybe doesn't know where to begin?
One is obviously just the persistence of it and the continuing to sort of, evangelize the idea that you have and the vision that you have for what could be. I think that's been a really big part of it. It would have been easy to walk away from this early on, but we've kind of just looked at the different opportunities, the different challenges that the state have faced where a tool like Pivot we thought could be a solution, and just made sure that we were constant advocates for it in those spots. Throughout this period, three different commissioners of the agency. Luckily, all three of them have been really supportive of my work. But you know, each time you've got to be patient because that requires, in working through an organization as big as state government or even as the agency, you've got to frequently, reintroduce this idea to new people and partners along the way. And so I think just trying to stay the course with it, and being patient but also persistent, and then just being an advocate for how what we were advocating for would improve the lives of the people that we're seeking to serve.
You mentioned the buy-in from the 3 commissioners. I'm curious, are there any other stakeholders or leaders who you feel are critical to get buy-in from if you were thinking from the shoes of another person in another state in a similar position?
Well, so in our case, it was really important for the decision makers at the other agencies whose data we sought to use as part of this project were really key. So in our case, the Department of Education, the Commission for Higher Education, their buy-in to allow this to persist was really critical because, again, their data sources improve the ultimate product, as we work through this. And so that was really key. We had to work with our state's Office of Management and Budget, and I think that, again, we were able to fund this with federal dollars, but in Indiana, we want to make sure that the federal dollars still, need to make sure that we're getting the best possible return on investment, and so getting the buy-in there was really critical. We also worked with some key legislators trying to make sure that, that this was a kind of an idea that could get their support. And again, and we've been supported. I think also just trying to make sure that you weren't going down a path where you would get legislative pushback. And I think with a tool like this, that's always a risk. Again, as we take this journey into AI, where I think even those, that are experts in it still aren't quite really sure what's at the end of this path. I think that makes, working with legislature really critical. Anybody who could come back and reverse your decisions, or end them, I think it's been important to get the buy-in. But we've had a really good run with that. I mean, really good questions along the way, some skepticism, some pushback along the way, but ultimately all of that has led to a better product.
Yeah, well, kudos to you and the DWD team because that is a lot of different people and perspectives that need to be on board and moving in the same direction to make something like this possible. And I know how much determination that takes to really be an advocate for the end outcome here. And it sounds like you're well on your way to really proving the model and hopefully continuing to grow it beyond the term of the grant and some of these early successes. My last question about Indiana, you have described how Indiana had the right circumstances and you worked really hard to make sure that this could come together. What do you think might be unique about Indiana that has made the development of Pivot possible? And how can other states potentially replicate this environment?
I think that a lot of that credit goes, far beyond me to people before. I think the quality of our data, and again, when I say that, there are still a lot of challenges and sort of data quality issues, but I think Indiana is a little bit ahead of the curve of both data storage, data quality, and with our management and performance hub, the ability to do sort of efficient record linkage across state agencies, I think is something that, even if other states sort of decided tomorrow that they wanted to do this, would have a lot longer timeline than we had because of that setup. I think also, the state formally having a chief privacy officer, a place where you could go to get answers to these questions, because, sometimes it's nobody's really sure who's in charge or who is the final say over, questions like this. And I think that helped us as well. That's also embedded within that management and performance hub. But I think that's the real setup that allowed Indiana to do this. I'll also say, and it's an important part of the story, that we have a modernized unemployment insurance system, and this became an issue during the pandemic, but a lot of states are still operating on very, very old technologies to process unemployment insurance claims. And so, because Indiana is modernized and all online, it makes the delivery of these recommendations significantly easier than if we were taking applications on paper based or phone based systems.
It's great to see Indiana really leading on this issue. You mentioned that there are other tools out there, but having been in a similar position in around 2019, I mean, I we were looking at similar goals or outcomes that we wanted to achieve, and the technology really wasn't there, and the baseline foundation with the data wasn't there at the time. So it's really exciting to see that Indiana has brought this tool to life, and just give kudos to you and the DWD and resultant teams for bringing all the bright minds together to get it done. I know it's never easy implementing a new initiative, but it's really exciting to hear the potential impact that this can have for Hoosiers and for employers in Indiana. So now that we're kind of concluding our discussion for the day, I wanted to ask you if there was one big thing that you wanted our listeners to take away from our conversation today, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think that it's the potential of tools like this to empower citizens to be better decision makers. It's something that I'm really passionate about. And I think if you look at the history of programs like this, the technology and the accessibility of a lot of this data led to really the only thing that a lot of governments could do is sort of create generally applicable lists that would sort of rank jobs in the aggregate. And so, we used to hang posters in offices that would say, hey, these are the top jobs in your area. But because they were so aggregate, I think that not only were they unhelpful at times, but could almost be frustrating. And so, in our context, I mean, I just lost the only job that I've ever known, 22 years working at a manufacturing facility. I've got a high school degree and I walk into an office and the top five jobs require advanced degrees. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to pay my mortgage or my car payment next month, probably not doing those things. And I think as the data and technology allow us to, being able to provide people more individualized, granular advice that allows them to act in their own interest, I think is going to yield better results. That's the theory of pivot, that we don't have to create lists, or we can be a little less heavy-handed in saying we will fund this kind of training, we won't fund that. If we can arm people with the information, they will help us reach optimal results instead of having to try to force people towards what we see as optimal. I think that's what's really exciting to me, both about pivot, but also where we can go with our data and the technology that will facilitate that.
I love that. What a great message to conclude our conversation today about the potential of technology to really evolve from what sounds like a one size fits all approach to demand for jobs in the economy to more of a customized user based solution. And that is something that we've heard very consistently on this podcast from others that we've talked with, is just the potential to make processes, decision making, and user experience so much better. So really cool to see Indiana on the cutting edge of that, and to see all the work that you've done that's led up to that. If we want to stay in touch with DWD or follow developments with Pivot, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, one way to do that would just be by following our social media. We also have a website at dwd.in.gov where we'll continue to put out press releases when there are any meaningful updates. We are looking to expand Pivot beyond just unemployment insurance claimants and to make it more broadly accessible to individuals who would like to understand how or what kind of career changes might improve their future. And so, really hoping to do that. And so, I would say just keep an eye on social media, and our communication shop does a pretty good idea working to keep people updated on where Pivot and our other programs are at.
Excellent. Thank you. We will link to that information in the podcast notes. Josh, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing a little bit more about Pivot and the work that DWD has done, and giving some good inspiration and food for thought for other leaders who are thinking about using AI for good.
And Emily, I appreciate so much the opportunity to talk with you and your listeners. This was really fun.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Workmorphous Wired. If you enjoyed the conversation, please let us know by leaving a rating and review. To make sure you don't miss any future episodes, be sure to subscribe. Finally, if you found value in today's discussion, we hope you'll pass the podcast along to a friend or colleague. As always, thanks for tuning out the noise and tuning in to Workmorphous Wired.